Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that one of the most important trade routes connecting the American heartland to the rest of the world depends heavily on infrastructure that Canada manages. That is not a hypothetical scenario. It is the reality of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway. And right now, that reality matters because the United States and Canada are entering another major stage of their trade dispute. The United States has imposed new 50% tariffs on certain Canadian goods, with those measures taking effect August 22nd. Canada has announced matching counter-tariffs on approximately $27.6 billion worth of U.S. imports, with the new measures scheduled to begin at 12:01 a.m. on September 8th. And underneath all of this is something that many Canadians may not realize. Canada manages 13 of the 15 locks in the St. Lawrence Seaway between Montreal and Lake Erie. 13 out of 15. That does not mean Canada can simply shut down American trade whenever it wants. It does not mean Canada owns the entire Great Lakes, and it certainly does not mean there is some secret button in Ottawa that can turn American shipping on or off. But it does demonstrate something extremely important. The American and Canadian economies are not simply neighbors separated by a border. They are deeply integrated. And nowhere is that integration more obvious than along the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence corridor. Some people call the Great Lakes region America's fourth coast, alongside the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts. The term has been used for years to describe the enormous maritime importance of the Great Lakes. U.S. maritime officials have also referred to the Great Lakes as the country's fourth coast. So when we talk about tariffs, we are not just talking about politicians arguing over percentages. We are talking about steel, agricultural equipment, dairy products, appliances, electronics, paper, industrial materials, and the transportation networks that move these goods across borders. For Canadian seniors, this matters for another reason. Your CPP, OAS, or GIS payment is not suddenly being reduced because of this tariff dispute. There is no announcement saying your regular government benefit has been cut because of these tariffs. But your household budget can still be affected by the economic consequences of a prolonged trade dispute, and that is what we are going to explain today. If you appreciate straightforward updates for Canadian seniors without unnecessary political noise, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We focus on the information that can actually affect your retirement, your household budget, and your financial planning. Because later in this video, we are going to connect this enormous trade story to something much closer to home: what happens to prices, employment, interest rates, and purchasing power when two deeply connected economies begin putting barriers in each other's way. And there is one detail about the 13 Canadian locks that makes this story particularly interesting. Let's get into it. First, we need to understand exactly what the 13 of 15 figure means. The St. Lawrence Seaway is a binational transportation system. It allows ships to travel from the Atlantic Ocean through the St. Lawrence River and into the Great Lakes, providing access to ports throughout the industrial heartland of North America. The Seaway includes 15 locks between Montreal and Lake Erie. Canada manages 13 of those locks. The United States manages 2. The Canadian portion is operated by the St. Lawrence Seaway Management Corporation, while the American portion is managed by the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation. The important point is that this is a shared system, so the 13 Canadian locks should not be interpreted as Canada having unilateral control over every ship moving through the Great Lakes. The system is governed and operated through a long-standing binational framework, but strategically the geography is fascinating. Canada controls most of the locks between Montreal and Lake Erie, and the Welland Canal is particularly important because all 8 of its locks are on the Canadian side. That canal allows ships to bypass Niagara Falls and move between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So when someone says Canada has 13 of the 15 locks, that is not an internet rumor or a political slogan. It is a documented fact. The Government of Canada says the Seaway serves 2 Canadian provinces, 8 U.S. states, and more than 100 ports and commercial docks, connecting them to highways and rail lines. In 2023, cargo traffic through the Seaway reached 37.6 million tons. That is a tremendous amount of economic activity, and it helps explain why the Great Lakes are sometimes described as a coast. Because if you look at the map, you might think of Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Duluth, Milwaukee, Buffalo, or Toledo as inland cities. But economically and commercially, many of these places are connected to the global maritime system. Ships can move cargo from the interior of North America toward the Atlantic and then onward to international markets. That means the Great Lakes are not just beautiful bodies of water. They are economic infrastructure. And that brings us to the tariff issue. The latest escalation began after Canada-US trade negotiations failed to produce the agreement the two governments wanted. On August 22nd, the United States imposed additional 50% tariffs on covered Canadian origin goods under Section 338 measures. The measures cover specific categories and include important exclusions, so it is incorrect to say that every Canadian export suddenly faces a 50% tariff. That distinction is extremely important. A headline saying 50% tariffs on Canada can make it sound as though every product crossing the border has become 50% more expensive. That is not what the official tariff structure says. The tariffs apply to specified goods. Some products and sectors are excluded or treated differently. Energy and certain other categories have been treated separately, and the precise tariff depends on the product and applicable trade rules. Canada's response is also targeted. The federal government says its new counter-tariffs will apply to products worth approximately $27.6 billion in U.S. imports and will include rates of 15%, 25%, and 50%, depending on the product and matching U.S. tariff measure. The effective date is September 8th. That date matters, because between now and then, Canadian businesses, American businesses, importers, exporters, retailers, and consumers have to figure out what the new environment means for them. And this is where the story becomes relevant to seniors. You may be thinking, I am retired, I don't import steel, I don't operate a shipping company, why should I care? Because economic shocks do not stay inside the industries where they begin. They move through supply chains. A tariff can affect an importer. The importer may pay more. The supplier may absorb part of the cost, the retailer may absorb another part, and eventually some portion of the increased cost may reach the consumer. But that does not mean every product will suddenly become more expensive by the exact tariff percentage. That is another important distinction. Tariffs are taxes on imports, but the economic burden can be distributed in different ways depending on the market. Businesses can change suppliers, they can reduce margins. They can raise prices, they can redesign products, they can delay investment, or they can decide that a particular transaction is no longer profitable. And when you are living on a fixed or relatively predictable retirement income, even modest increases across several categories can become meaningful. But there is another side to the story. Trade disputes can also create opportunities for Canadian businesses that replace imported goods with domestic products, and that is where the story becomes much more complicated. The first group affected is businesses directly involved in the targeted trade. That includes manufacturers, exporters, importers, suppliers, and workers connected to industries covered by the tariffs. The Canadian government's countermeasures focus on sectors including steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, plastics, and electronics. Some businesses may be able to find alternative markets, others may find alternative suppliers. Some may be able to pass costs along, and some will have a much harder time. The second group is workers. When a company loses access to a major market, it may reduce production. If production falls, overtime can disappear. Hiring can slow. Temporary workers may be affected. And in more severe cases, layoffs can occur. That is why the federal government has announced a $5 billion package of new and enhanced measures intended to support workers and businesses affected by the tariff environment. But now let's talk about retirees. For seniors, one of the most important effects to watch is not necessarily your government check. It is purchasing power. Suppose your monthly income remains exactly the same, but your grocery bill, household expenses, transportation costs, or replacement costs for appliances and other goods rise. Your nominal income has not changed, but your purchasing power has. That is the distinction seniors should keep in mind. And there is another issue. Many retirees have investments. If a prolonged trade conflict weakens economic growth, financial markets can become more volatile. That does not automatically mean markets will fall. It does not mean your retirement portfolio is in danger, and nobody can reliably predict exactly what the stock market will do next. But trade uncertainty can influence business investment, corporate earnings, currencies, inflation expectations, and interest rate expectations. Those factors can affect financial markets. So if you are retired, the lesson is not sell everything. The lesson is to understand what you actually own, how much risk you are taking, and whether your retirement plan can withstand periods of market volatility. That is a much more useful response than reacting emotionally to every tariff headline. And there is one more group we need to discuss: government benefit recipients. CPP, OAS, and GIS are governed by their own eligibility and payment rules. The tariff announcements we are discussing today do not constitute a change to CPP, OAS, or GIS eligibility or payment formulas. So please do not let social media posts convince you that a tariff announcement automatically means your next OAS or GIS payment is being reduced. That is not what the official announcements say. However, the economy surrounding those programs matters, and that is where the next part becomes especially important. Think about the Great Lakes as a giant economic highway. Instead of trucks driving on pavement, ships move across water. Instead of fuel stations and highway interchanges, you have ports, terminals, locks, rail connections, and industrial facilities. The St. Lawrence Seaway is essentially a marine transportation corridor connecting the interior of North America to global markets. Transport Canada says cargo moving through the Seaway includes grain, iron ore, petroleum products, stone, and aggregates. That means disruptions can have consequences far beyond the waterfront. Consider grain. A farmer produces grain. That grain has to be stored, then transported, then loaded, then shipped, then unloaded, then processed or exported. Every link in that chain depends on infrastructure. Now imagine one part becomes more expensive or less predictable. The cost can move through the entire chain. The same applies to industrial materials. A steel manufacturer may need certain inputs. A factory may need machinery. A distributor may need transportation. A retailer may need imported components. Modern economies are built on interconnected systems. That is why trade wars are rarely as simple as one country wins and the other country loses. Both sides can experience costs, and sometimes the people who have the least ability to adjust are ordinary households. For a wealthy company, a temporary increase in costs may be manageable. For a retiree carefully budgeting every month, an unexpected $50 or $100 increase in household expenses can feel very different. But remember something important. We should not exaggerate. There is no evidence that these tariffs automatically mean a financial crisis for Canadian seniors. There is also no evidence that the Seaway is about to be shut down. In fact, the Seaway remains a jointly operated bi-national transportation system. The 13 of 15 figure is about the locks managed by Canada, not a declaration that Canada has decided to stop American trade. That distinction matters because sensational headlines can create unnecessary fear. The real story is more interesting. Canada and the United States have created an economic system in which each country depends heavily on the other, and tariffs expose just how deep that dependence really is. Now let's focus on the date every Canadian following this story should know: September 8, 2026. That is when Canada's newly announced counter-tariffs are scheduled to take effect. The federal government's official list says the measures will begin at 12:01 a.m. on September 8th and will cover targeted U.S. products at rates corresponding to the applicable U.S. measures. This does not mean every Canadian should rush out and buy everything before September 8th. Please don't do that. If you need something, buy it because you need it. Do not panic buy because you saw a social media video predicting that prices will instantly explode on September 8th. Tariff implementation is more complicated than that. Businesses have inventory, products can be exempt, contracts can have different terms, suppliers can change, exchange rates can move, and companies can choose different strategies. The September 8th date is important because it marks the scheduled implementation of Canada's new response. It does not mean every Canadian household will experience the same financial effect on that morning, and this is one reason seniors should focus on verified information. The federal government has already published the product list. If you are a business owner or investor, the details may matter enormously. If you are a retiree, the broader economic effects are more important than memorizing hundreds of tariff codes, and there is another reason to watch September. The government has said it is continuing to support workers and businesses during the uncertainty. That support package is worth paying attention to if someone in your household is still working, if you have adult children affected by the trade dispute, or if your local economy depends heavily on affected industries. So don't just watch the tariff percentage, watch the economic response, watch employment, watch inflation, watch consumer prices, watch interest rate expectations, and watch whether negotiations resume. Because tariffs are a policy tool, they are not necessarily the final destination. There are several mistakes I want Canadian seniors to avoid as this story develops. The first is assuming that a 50% tariff means a 50% price increase for consumers. It doesn't work that simply. The tariff is applied to covered imports according to the rules governing those products. The eventual consumer price depends on the supply chain and on how businesses respond. The second mistake is believing that CPP, OAS, or GIS payments automatically change because tariffs changed. They don't. A trade announcement does not rewrite the eligibility rules for those programs. The third mistake is assuming that Canada controlling 13 of 15 locks means Canada can simply close the Seaway whenever it wants. That is an oversimplification. The Seaway is a binational system with established operating arrangements between Canada and the United States. The fourth mistake is reacting emotionally to investment market headlines. If the market moves because of trade uncertainty, that does not automatically mean your retirement plan has failed. A portfolio should be designed around your time horizon, income needs, and risk tolerance. The fifth mistake is making major purchases purely because you are afraid tariffs will make everything more expensive tomorrow. That can actually hurt your finances. If you spend $3,000 today to avoid a hypothetical future increase that never materializes, you may have created a bigger problem than the tariff itself. And the sixth mistake is ignoring your household budget. This one may sound boring, but it is probably the most practical. When the economic environment becomes uncertain, knowing exactly where your money goes becomes more valuable. So what should you actually do? Start by separating your guaranteed or government-supported income from everything else. Know how much comes from CPP. Know how much comes from OAS. If you receive GIS, know the conditions that determine your eligibility. Then look at other sources of income, including workplace pensions, RRSP withdrawals, TFSA withdrawals, investment income, or employment income if you are still working. The point is to understand how dependent your household is on each source. Next, review your essential expenses: housing, food, utilities, transportation, insurance, medication and health-related expenses, debt payments, and the ordinary costs that keep your household running. You do not need to predict the future. You simply need to know how much flexibility you have. If prices rise temporarily, could you absorb the increase? If investments become volatile, could you avoid selling at the worst possible moment? If a family member loses employment, could you help without damaging your own retirement security? Those are better questions than trying to predict exactly what President Trump or Prime Minister Carney will say next. And if you still have investments, consider reviewing your portfolio with a qualified financial professional if you are unsure about your risk exposure. Not because tariffs automatically mean you should sell, but because every major period of uncertainty is a good reminder to make sure your portfolio actually matches your retirement plan. And if you have adult children or grandchildren working in manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, or other trade-sensitive industries, talk with them. The tariff dispute may affect their employment or business conditions differently from yours. That family conversation could be more valuable than another hour scrolling through political headlines. And if you own a small business, pay close attention to official tariff classifications and government support programs. The Canadian government has announced new support measures for affected businesses and workers, and the details matter. This is also where I want to remind you that government websites are more useful than viral social media posts. A dramatic headline can tell you that Canada is winning or Canada is losing. Neither phrase tells you what your household actually needs to do. The official tariff list tells you what products are covered. The official benefit information tells you how CPP, OAS, and GIS work, and your own budget tells you how prepared you are. That's the information that matters. But this story is not only about risk, there is also a potential opportunity. Canada has spent decades trading heavily with the United States. That relationship has created enormous economic benefits, but it has also created dependence. When the United States changes trade policy, Canadian businesses feel it quickly. That is why the federal government has been emphasizing diversification, internal trade, and nation-building projects. Prime Minister Mark Carney has said Canada needs to strengthen its domestic economy and diversify partnerships rather than simply assume the old Canada-US relationship will return unchanged. That could mean more investment in Canadian infrastructure, more attention to domestic supply chains, more exports to Europe and Asia, more investment in ports, more investment in rail, more investment in energy infrastructure, and potentially more Canadian production of goods that are currently imported. But again, we need to be realistic. Diversification takes time. You cannot replace decades of integrated Canada-US trade in a few months. Building new supply chains takes investment, finding new customers takes time. And Canadian businesses cannot simply flip a switch and replace the American market overnight. Still, the current crisis could accelerate changes that were already underway. And for Canadian seniors, the long-term economic consequences matter because the strength of the Canadian economy affects government revenues, employment, investment returns, and the broader environment in which retirement programs operate. This is not about saying CPP or OAS will disappear. They are not disappearing because of this tariff dispute. It is about recognizing that retirement security exists inside a much larger economy. Let's return to that number. Canada manages 13 of the 15 locks in the St. Lawrence Seaway between Montreal and Lake Erie. That number is interesting because it tells us something bigger than who controls a lock. It tells us how interconnected North America really is. The United States is a global economic superpower. Canada is a major trading nation, and their economies are physically connected through infrastructure that neither country can easily ignore. The Great Lakes are not merely a border, they are a shared economic system. The St. Lawrence Seaway is not simply a Canadian waterway or an American waterway. It is a binational transportation network, and that means the tariff dispute has a built-in contradiction. Both governments can use tariffs as leverage, but both countries also have incentives to keep trade moving. American farmers want access to markets. American manufacturers need Canadian inputs. Canadian manufacturers need American customers. Canadian consumers buy American products. American consumers buy Canadian products. And millions of people depend indirectly on this relationship. That is why the coming months will be so important. The question is not simply whether one side can impose a tariff, The bigger question is how long the two economies can tolerate higher costs and greater uncertainty before both sides have stronger reasons to compromise. And that brings us to the most important takeaway for Canadian seniors. Don't confuse political drama with personal financial action. You can follow the news without letting the news control your retirement decisions. There are several things I would watch closely over the next few weeks. First, watch the September 8th Canadian counter-tariff implementation. Second, watch whether the two governments return to serious negotiations. Third, watch for changes to the list of products covered by the tariffs. Fourth, watch inflation data. Fifth, watch employment data, especially in trade-sensitive regions. And sixth, watch what happens to businesses and communities connected to manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, and ports. The federal government has already said its response is intended to protect Canadian workers, farmers, fishers, families, and businesses. But policies can evolve, tariff lists can change, negotiations can restart, exemptions can appear, and political pressure can change the direction of the dispute. So if you hear someone confidently predicting exactly what will happen 6 months from now, be cautious. Nobody knows. The responsible approach is to follow confirmed announcements and prepare for reasonable possibilities. That is especially important for retirees. Your retirement plan should not depend on getting the next political prediction correct. It should depend on having enough flexibility to handle uncertainty. So let's bring everything together. The first takeaway is simple. The United States and Canada are in a significant new phase of their trade dispute. The United States has imposed new 50% tariffs on covered Canadian goods effective August 22, 2026. Canada has responded with targeted counter-tariffs covering approximately $27.6 billion in U.S. imports, scheduled to take effect September 8th. Second, the Great Lakes are economically enormous. They are sometimes called America's fourth coast because of their maritime importance. Third, Canada manages 13 of the 15 locks in the St. Lawrence Seaway between Montreal and Lake Erie. But that does not mean Canada has unilateral control over the entire Great Lakes trade system. It is a shared binational system. Fourth, the tariff dispute can affect ordinary Canadians indirectly through prices, jobs, investment markets, and economic growth. But there is no basis for saying these tariffs automatically reduce CPP, OAS, or GIS payments. Fifth, September 8th is the important date to watch for Canada's newly announced counter-tariffs. And finally, don't panic. Don't make major financial decisions because of one dramatic headline. Don't assume every product will suddenly cost 50% more. Don't assume your government benefits are being cut, and don't assume you need to completely change your investment strategy because of a political dispute. Instead, understand your income, understand your expenses, keep an emergency cushion where appropriate, review your investments, follow official government announcements, and stay alert to changes that could affect your household. Because the most important lesson from the Fourth Coast story is not that Canada has some secret weapon against America. It is that Canada and the United States are deeply connected. The Great Lakes demonstrate that connection physically. The supply chains demonstrate it economically. And millions of Canadian and American families demonstrate it every day. This trade dispute is therefore much bigger than a fight over tariffs. It is a test of how two neighboring economies respond when decades of integration collide with a new era of economic nationalism. For Canadian seniors, the best response is not fear. It is preparation. Your CPP, OAS, and GIS should be understood separately from the political headlines. Your household budget should be built around realistic assumptions. And your retirement decisions should be based on your financial situation, not on the latest viral prediction. There is a lot still to unfold. The September 8th measures are approaching. Negotiations could change. Tariff lists could change. Economic conditions could change. And the effects on Canadian households will become clearer over time. So keep watching the facts, not the noise. If this video helped you understand why 13 Canadian locks, the Great Lakes, and the current tariff dispute matter to your retirement and household finances, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We will continue following the developments that matter to Canadian seniors, retirees, CPP recipients, OAS recipients, and GIS recipients, and will separate confirmed government information from speculation. Because when you're protecting your retirement, staying informed is one of the most valuable things you can do. And remember this, the headline may be about tariffs. The argument may be between governments, but the real story is about the economy that all of us live in. Stay informed, stay prepared, and most importantly, don't let political uncertainty make financial decisions for you.